This is Justice, History, and the Law. Lectures, discussions, and interviews from the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York.
July 23, 2003. Ambassador John Dolibois spoke at Chautauqua Institution during Security and Justice Week. John Dolibois is a man with an interesting past. John, born in Luxembourg in 1918, only lived in his native country for a limited time. His mother's death shortly after his birth meant that John's elder sister helped to raise him until she left for Akron, Ohio. In 1931, John and his father followed his sister and reunited the family. John remained in the United States and attended Miami University. In 1942, he entered military service as an armored force officer and then moved on to military intelligence. It is here that the paths of John Dolibois and Robert Jackson cross. It was through the Military Intelligence Service that John Dolibois assisted in the interrogation of the Nazi war criminals prior to the Nuremberg trial. Dolibois, now a former U.S. ambassador to Luxembourg, spoke at Chautauqua Institution about his experiences as an interrogator for the Allies. During his speech, Dolibois shared a story of his first meeting with Hermann Goering. Goering was sent to his office, unaware that Dolibois was an interrogator. As a result of this misunderstanding, Goering spoke considerably more freely than he would have had he known the truth about Dolibois.
It's a real thrill to introduce our speaker for today, Mr. Ambassador John Dolibois was ambassador to Luxembourg at some critical time, and he has also seen some critical times in history. And you might notice the article in the Daily today. And without further ado, it's a real pleasure to introduce him, and I'm sure you'll enjoy what he has to say.
Well, it's just a little bit after 12 o'clock, so I can say good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate that nice introduction. I'm sorry you didn't say more, because I like to have I like to have my ego stroked. But on the other hand, I'm glad you didn't say more, because when you give all of this illustrious background, people think, well, gee, this is a very important man. But I don't let it go to my head, because I found a long time ago that if you think you're very important, there's always someone who thinks he's more important than you are. And of course, this is not one of Robert Jackson's stories, but it does concern Franklin D. Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin, who were attending their conference in Yalta. And after enjoying their meetings, they retired to a private chamber to enjoy their favorite smoke and drink. And they no sooner sat down when Winston Churchill said, "Now, gentlemen, you should know that I, Winston Churchill, more than anyone else in the history of the world, influenced the major decisions that shaped the first half of this century." Well, Stalin couldn't let that go by. He took a puff on his pipe and a sip of his drink, his vodka, and then he said, "And yet, the Almighty, God Almighty, said to me, Joseph Stalin, you will rule the world." Whereupon Franklin D. Roosevelt lit his cigarette, took a sip of his champagne, and he said, "Now, Joe, I never said anything like that to you." So you can see why I don't want to listen to too much of an illustrious introduction. Now, thank you for inviting me to this charming community of Chautauqua. I feel very much like the Okefenokee swamp boy who fell into a barrel of molasses, and all he could think of to say was, "Oh, Lord, give me a mouth big enough to do justice to the occasion." So I hope that I can do the same thing now. Now, I'm not a lecturer. I'm a storyteller. I've been very fortunate to have be exposed to a very interesting career, and I enjoy the opportunity of being able to share some of my recollections and experiences with you. For those of you who have read my book, Pattern of Circles, you can go to sleep now, because everything that I know is between the covers of this book. But I do want to answer the question that several of you have asked in the course of our visit to Chautauqua. What does the title Pattern of Circles mean? Well, unfortunately, it's an appropriate title, but it gives the impression that this is a math book of some kind, and so it's not a bestseller, and it doesn't have enough sex and violence in it. So the title Pattern of Circles and the absence of all of the violence and sex doesn't compare to Stephen King or some of those. But it's an autobiography, and it's called A Pattern of Circles because my life's journey has been a pattern of circles. I was born in the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg and came to the United States at the age of 13. And I might point out here that when I arrived in the United States with my father, my mother had died, we came on the SS Lapland, a Belgian liner. And after 17 days on the Atlantic Ocean, one morning, I woke up, the boat was standing still. And I heard people shouting, and I heard what I thought was gunfire, and I decided the cowboys and Indians are at it, and I'm going to have to see the action. So I hurriedly got dressed, went up onto the deck, and the first thing I saw was the Statue of Liberty. We were anchored just about 200 yards from it in New York Harbor. And then I turned and saw the skyline of New York, the skyscrapers, buildings that reached up into the clouds. I had not seen anything like that in the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. And I found that the shouting and the gunfire actually was fireworks, and people were celebrating the 4th of July. We had made safe harbor in New York on Independence Day. And my recommendation is, if you come to the United States as an immigrant, plan to arrive on the 4th of July. It's a very proper introduction. But it all went downhill after that, because the next day we left for Akron, Ohio, where my father and I were going to live with a sister. I say downhill because as a 13-year-old boy, I still had to face schooling, and I had to go to school at Findlay School in Akron, Ohio. I couldn't speak a word of English. I had picked up a few words on the street during that summer, but you couldn't use them in school. So they decided wisely, I think, to put me in kindergarten. Now, if you're 13 years old and you're in kindergarten, that's a rather traumatic experience. I spent 3 months in kindergarten learning the English language from the bottom up. Then I was promoted to the 3rd grade. And then, of course, eventually ended up in the 6th grade, still 2 years behind everybody else. But, you know, I've always been very grateful to the principal and the teachers of Findlay School for starting me at the bottom, because from there on in, all through high school and college, English was my best subject. It also has made me very prejudiced. I firmly believe that if you come to the United States as an immigrant to take advantage of all of the freedoms and the opportunities that our great country offers, the least you can do is learn the language. So I'm against bilingual education. Well, as an immigrant, 50 years later, I had the good fortune to be named as your representative, as the United States ambassador to Luxembourg. That, of course, is a rather unique experience. As far as I can tell and what I've been told, I'm the first ambassador who was ever appointed to his native country as a naturalized American. Now, Luxembourg, those of you who know where Luxembourg is and you have a map big enough to find it, the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg is 999 square miles. Now, people say, why didn't they go out and give them another square mile and make it an even 1,000? And the Luxembourgers say, well, we tried that once, but we couldn't teach them the language, so we gave it back to them. So it's still 999 square miles. With a population now of approximately 380, close to 400,000 people, 26% of which are foreigners, because Luxembourg is a very important country, in spite of its size and its location between France, Belgium, and Germany. Luxembourg has one vote in the United Nations, but so does France, Germany, and everybody else. Luxembourg is a member of NATO, charter member, one vote like everybody else. Luxembourg belongs to the European Community and has been a devoted friend, loyal friend of the United States since World War I, when the Germans occupied Luxembourg and the American armies under General Jack Pershing liberated Luxembourg and restored to it its sovereignty. And in World War II, when the Nazis occupied Luxembourg, again, General Patton came along and liberated Luxembourg, with the result that there's one country in the world guaranteed to be very fond of Americans. Now, if you're a native of Luxembourg, like I am, and you come back 50 years after having left to be the ambassador of the country that's very popular in Luxembourg, they really roll out the red carpet. So we had a very interesting and challenging experience. But the thing you want to know about, if you've read the resume of my topic, is how did you get to be an interrogator during the war? How did you end up in military intelligence? Well, to quickly explain that, when I went through schooling in Akron, Ohio, I ended up at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, to which I also brought my wife, Winnie, who is here today, and the four of us went through Miami together. I never had to worry about a date. Consequently, we graduated. I went to work for Procter & Gamble in Cincinnati, when, lo and behold, my neighbors got together and decided to do me dirt, that I would now end up in the Army. I reported to Fort Thomas, Kentucky, just across the river from Cincinnati where we lived. And I'll never forget the young PFC who sat there behind the table and he looked at my papers very studiously. And then he said, "Well, Dolibois, what can you do?" Well, I've heard my name mispronounced, but I thought he was overdoing it a little bit. And I proceeded to correct him, and that's the first mistake I made in the Army. He looked at my papers and he said, "Well, what can you do?" And I said, "Well, I was born in Luxembourg, and I can speak German fluently, and I'd like to get into military intelligence." He said, "Did you ever drive a truck?" And I said, "No, but I can speak German fluently." Well, he said, "How about a bus or a tractor or a plow or something heavy with air brakes?" I wasn't going to give up so easily. I said, "No, but I can speak German fluently." Well, a day later, my minute and a half was up, and a day later, I was on a troop train on my way to Fort Knox, Kentucky, where the Army made a tank driver out of me. So with a major in psychology and a knowledge of French and German, I ended up being a tank driver in the armored force. But I applied myself, with the result that eventually I went through OCS, became a 90-day wonder, and got my commission from no less a person than General George S. Patton, Jr., who was the commander of the 8th Armored Corps at that time and was the commencement speaker when I graduated from OCS. And that was a very significant beginning of my military career. I was assigned to Camp Chaffee, Arkansas, the home of the 16th Armored Division, where Elvis Presley did his basic training, and it is now one of our basic shrines. But they paid no attention to my being there until many months later, somebody stuck a pin in the right hole, and my card dropped out. They found out I could speak German fluently. So on 3 hours' notice, not even enough time to say goodbye to my wife who was with me, I was transferred to military intelligence, where I should have been in the first place. Went to Washington, and then ended up in Camp Ritchie, Maryland, which is a special training center where the Army trained its intelligence personnel. And I fitted into a category called IPW, Interrogator Prisoners of War. And 2 months crash course on how to interrogate prisoners, applying the psychology that I had majored in college, and of course the military training that I was fortunate enough to have in the armored force, with the result that after 2 months of my special course, they decided that I should be a teacher at Camp Ritchie and train others. Because as a teacher, you learn a lot more than you do as a student. With the result that I became a specialist in interrogation after serving 10 months as a teacher at Camp Ritchie. And when I finally did go overseas, I became an interrogator for strategic interrogation instead of tactical interrogation. So I interrogated only prisoners of general rank or scientists who had worked on atomic research or the V1, V2, bacterial chemical warfare, that sort of interrogation. And when the war ended, and I came back to my headquarters in Reagan, France, the commanding officer said, "I have a special assignment for you. You're going to be transferred because we're going to close down our strategic interrogation operation. You're going to a place I've never heard of before. It's called Mundorf, Luxembourg." Well, I knew the Army by then, so I kept my big mouth shut. If I told them I was born in Luxembourg, that's exactly where I wanted to go, I'd have ended up in the Philippine Islands or So I kept quiet, with the result that I ended up in Luxembourg 14 years later after having been an immigrant. So I was born in Luxembourg, came back as an officer in the American Army, and then after the war, 4 years later, I came back to the United States to start my career on the staff of Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. And after 35 years at that, I came back to Luxembourg as ambassador. And after serving that tour, I came back to the United States to write a book about my impressions and experiences. And that's why it's called Pattern of Circles. When I arrived in Luxembourg, I had no idea what I was getting into because my commanding officer wasn't able to tell me. But when I got there, I found in Mundorf, which is a resort town, very much like Chautauqua, very beautiful, located, beautiful trees, beautiful homes, and a large hotel, 4-story hotel called the Palace Hotel. Around that hotel, they had built a 10-foot barbed wire fence, machine gun towers on each of 4 corners, Klieg lights overhead, camouflage nets, screening materials. Looking at it from the outside, I had never seen an installation, which was obviously a prison of war installation, so heavily guarded and protected. And I asked the sergeant of the guard, the military police, I said, what kind of a place is this, Sergeant? What's going on in there? Well, he scratched his head and looked at me, and he said, well, Lieutenant, he says, I don't know. I've been here 3 weeks, and I've never been inside. All I know is to get in here, you have to have a pass signed by God, and somebody has to verify the signature. Well, apparently I had the right papers. They let me in, and once I got inside, I didn't get out for a whole month for reasons that I shall explain very shortly. But I was assigned to a room on the first floor of this hotel. Room number 30, as I recall. And I was in the process of unpacking my belongings, knowing that I would meet the rest of the staff later that afternoon, prepare my orders, when I heard a knock on the door. I thought this was one of the other officers coming in to introduce himself. So I opened the door and got the surprise of my life, because before me stood none other than a man that I had studied a great deal about. He stood approximately 5'10" this way and 5'10" that way, dressed in a very natty gray uniform bedecked with medals. He clicked his heels and bowed and introduced himself as Reichsmarschall Hermann Goering. I gave a very poor representation of an intelligence officer. I stood there with my mouth open. Finally collected my wits and asked Herr Goering to step inside, which he did, and immediately launched into a campaign of complaints about the way he was being treated. And of course, he was primarily interested in knowing who I was. He had watched my arrival from his cell window, and then he came knocking on my door to find out who I was. And he asked me the question. And of course, I was going to be honest. I was going to say I'm a member of military intelligence, and I'm here to be an interrogator, which amazed me, even myself. But before I could say that, he said, are you by any chance the welfare officer? He said, you're too young to be an interrogator, so you must be the welfare officer. And in a rare moment of intuition, I said, yes, I'll see to it that you get a square deal, that you're properly treated, which was an honest statement. He took it upon himself to inform the other prisoners that at last the Americans had wised up, and they brought somebody who would see to it that they all got a square deal and were protected according to the rules of the Geneva Convention. Well, that started my position. I reported that conversation to my commanding officer, and he says, great, that's your cover. You pretend to be the welfare officer, in addition to any interrogation you have to do, but you'll have an opportunity to get to know all of the prisoners that way, and you listen to the gossip, what they tell you about each other, about their experience and anything else, in addition to your formal interrogations. Well, I've always been very grateful to Hermann Goering for making that suggestion, because in the long run, I got more information than anybody else. And he, of course, enabled me to get a promotion and recognition as the welfare officer. Each one of us, in the course of our interrogations, and there were 5 members of military intelligence who had been especially trained, assigned to get this information. We had members of the 391st Anti-Aircraft Battalion, soldiers and officers who had fought in North Africa and Italy, and who are now getting a respite as being the guards of this special installation, which was called CCPWE number 32, Central Continental Prison of War Enclosure number 32. And I don't have any idea what the significance was, except it was a prison of war enclosure. It had a code name named Ashcan. And I thought that was an unusual code name for the Army to give, until I realized we had another place farther up north in the British sector called Dustbin, which I thought was equally strange until I realized how much trash we hold between Dustbin and Ashcan. And it indicated somebody had a sense of humor who assigned these code words. I mentioned the fact that Hermann Goering came knocking at my door, and you wonder how a prisoner of war would have the opportunity to walk around and come knocking on doors. Well, all of our prisoners were housed on the 3rd and 4th floors of this hotel. The furniture had been replaced with a folding army cot, a straw mattress, 2 or 3 GI blankets, a bucket of water, and a cake of Lifebuoy soap, the original Lifebuoy soap, the kind your mother put in your mouth when you use bad words. But the prisoners were not locked in. They could visit each other in their rooms, and they could walk all over the hotel, like come knocking on my door. They could sit on the veranda and enjoy the sunshine and walk in the hotel gardens within a barbed wire enclosure. That was by design, because by allowing them to exchange their opinions, to argue with each other, it stimulated conversation, and in the course of our interrogation, we capitalized on that freedom. We could easily say what one prisoner had said about the other and play them off against each other, which sounds unethical, but that was the only way we could do it. There were no recording devices, no torture devices. We didn't twist any arms, didn't pull any fingernails. All we had to do was to chat conversationally. Each one of us was assigned 10 or 12 prisoners about whose background we were most familiar with. So when we did our interrogation, it was based on the prisoners that we knew. What were we doing? The 5 of us were working for Justice Jackson, who was the head of the Nazi War Crimes Commission, which was to decide who was going to be tried at the first session of the International Tribunal in Nuremberg later that fall. So the Nazi War Crimes Commission under Justice Jackson would prepare questionnaires and briefs which would be sent to us in Luxembourg about each one of the prisoners, and then we would be assigned those prisoners for detailed interrogation, write up our reports, and the information that we got at Luxembourg went back to Justice Jackson, and on the basis of our interrogations, it was decided which 22 of the 86 high-ranking Nazis we had in captivity were to be tried at Nuremberg in the first session of the tribunal. So our role was to find out who was who. Amazingly, we had very little intelligence about the Nazi organization back in the 30s. We didn't even know what an Obersturmbannführer was. We didn't know about the SS, the SA. We had heard rumors from refugees, but it was not reliable information. So we wanted to know about the Nazi organization. We wanted to know about the characters, personalities of these high-ranking Nazis. We wanted to know, that is, the Nazi War Crimes Commission. Justice Jackson wanted to know who was at what meetings when decisions were made to establish concentration camps, to debate the final solution, which resulted in the extermination, the execution of more than 6 million Jews and non-Jews in concentration camps like Auschwitz, Birkenau, Soborbir, and others. So our job was to get the answer to those questions so that the prosecuting staff would be able to prepare its case for the prosecution and at the same time know which prisoners were the most responsible and were to be tried first. Now, while these prisoners had the freedom to move around the hotel, the second floor was a buffer between them and us. We were on the first floor. It's where our offices and interrogation rooms were. And then on the bottom floor, the ground floor, was a dining room where the prisoners ate off of porcelain plates with spoons only, no knives or forks permitted. We had ordinary German prisoners of war who did the cooking and the preparing of the food and the serving of the food. 1,600 calories a day, no more or less. That's prescribed by the Geneva Convention. We had a lounge, a living room, where the prisoners could listen to Armed Forces radio. And of course, we had the veranda where they could, and the gardens where they could walk and argue with each other and then come and squeal to us about what they learned about each other. Everybody was out to save his own neck, to protect himself. In that environment, we were doing exactly what is being done at Guantanamo Bay, Camp Xray right now. We have brought to Guantanamo Bay, to that camp, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, prisoners of war and political prisoners for the purpose of interrogating them and to find out from them exactly what we wanted to find out from the Nazis. We wanted to find out, we do now, where is Osama bin Laden and where is the mullah and some of the others. And when you read in a paper about certain Taliban and Al-Qaeda people being captured, the number 4 man, the number 5 man, and quite a few of the 52 have already been arrested and are now our prisoners. The information on where they were has been gotten from the interrogation at Guantanamo Bay. That's why those people are there. So when you read in the media that they're not being properly treated, that's a lot of baloney. They are eating better than our Marines who are guarding them. The problem with them is that they bite. I mean, literally bite. The interrogators have a rough time of it because these people attack. They want to die. They want to go to Allah and get those 72 Vestal virgins as a reward of being martyrs. Whereas our Nazi prisoners were very cooperative. They talked too much. We had to work overtime to put all of the information into writing and into our reports to Justice Jackson. So we had difficulty not in getting them to talk, but in getting them to shut up. They talked too much, squealing about each other, bragging about their own achievements, whether they were radical, fanatic Nazis and proud of it, or whether they were among that larger group in that pattern who were instructing skiers in the mountains and really didn't know what was going on in Germany. We had a lot of ski instructors in Germany. And then there were the others who were repentant, who were very sorry, and who confessed. Who were these people? Well, as I said, they wandered around freely. They could talk to each other, argue with each other, have a certain amount of freedom, come visit us at will. And I had an opportunity as welfare officer to go around and visit them and just sort of chat and say, how are you? Do you need any shampoo? Do you need any toothpaste? Do you need any letters translated? They were very busy writing letters to General Eisenhower and President Truman and others in command complaining about their treatment as heads of state and members of the government. But who were these people? Well, we suspected, although we weren't sure, that Hitler was dead. And we knew that Himmler was dead because he committed suicide in captivity. And we knew that Goebbels, the propaganda minister, was dead. And that's as far as we got. Now we had, as prisoner, the Reichsmarschall Hermann Goering, the number 2 Nazi. In their traveling around the hotel and visiting each other, they divided into 3 distinct social cliques. On one hand, we had all the members of the German General Staff, starting with Wilhelm Keitel, a General Field Marshal who was the chief of the Armed Forces High Command and who signed the surrender on the Eastern Front. Under him was Generaloberst Jodl, who was the chief of operations, second in command, who signed the surrender documents on the Western Front at Reims. And then we had other members of the German General Staff, Grand Admiral Dönitz, the commander-in-chief of submarine warfare, subsequently commander-in-chief of the Navy, and selected by Hitler to be his successor at the end of the Third Reich. Then we had members like von Rundstedt, the leader of the Battle of the Bulge, the Rundstedt Offensive, Field Marshal Kesselring, the commander of German troops in Italy, and who was also the commander-in-chief of the Western Front. Von Blomberg, a former chief of staff, and many others. German general staff, the elite of the military in the Third Reich. Well, they stuck pretty much together. They wanted nothing to do with the other prisoners, who were the Nazi element, the second category. These were men like Hans Frank, the Butcher of Poland, as he was known, who was the Governor General of Poland and confessed to the responsibility of signing the decrees that sent more than 2.5 million Jews to the extermination camps. Hans Frank, the Butcher of Poland. Under him, Julius Streicher, the Jew baiter, the Gauleiter of Franconia, who edited and published the pornographic anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer, and was the leading racist among the Nazis and prided himself on being the racist who hated the Jews with a passion and was determined to do away with them, not only in Germany, but in the rest of Europe and the world. Robert Ley, the Labor Front leader, you couldn't get a job in Germany without belonging to the Labor Front. 30 million members strong. A little fellow who came up to my shoulders, who was an alcoholic and stammered whenever he talked until he had a few drinks, and that loosened his tongue, and he overcame his stutter and gave his rabble-rousing speeches. Fritz Saukel, who was responsible for the slave laborers who were brought into German industry and factories and mines under Albert Speer, the man who was responsible for the munitions and the equivalent to our own Secretary of Defense. Men like Arthur Seyss-Inquart, who betrayed Austria and later became the military governor of the Netherlands. Well, these and others were the Alte Kämpfer, the old fighters, who had fought back in the putsch in 1923 and helped Hitler and his party come to power. Now, they were prisoners of war, political prisoners as well, and they stuck together, wanted nothing to do with the generals whom they blamed for losing the war. These were the fanatics still, right to the very end, with a few exceptions like Baldur von Schirach, the Hitler Youth leader, who confessed that he made a big mistake and, of course, ended up being anti-Hitler. I don't know whether that was for his own benefit, but it worked. He got only 20 years instead of the life sentence. And then, of course, there was the third group of prisoners, the German statesmen, the bureaucrats, the ministers, who had served as the secretaries of the agriculture, of commerce in Germany, who ran the German government and kept it going. Well, these men, again, wanted nothing to do with the Nazis. They wanted nothing to do with the generals, because they were the guys who had worked for the Kaiser during the First World War. They became they became social democrats in the Weimar Republic, and then became Nazis when Hitler came to power. So they were political opportunists. Well, we capitalized on that relationship. If we wanted to know about the Nazis, we asked the generals. If we want to know about the generals, we asked the Nazis or the bureaucrats who squealed on both. And we provided General Jackson with a lot more information, probably, than he wanted. But by August 12th, it was decided which 22 of the 86 were to be tried first. And then we got the word to pass these prisoners on to Nuremberg. By that time, I was sick of Nazis and Germans, and I begged my commanding officer to take me away from them. I wanted to go to Oberösel, Germany, to study the history of the German General Staff, a historical project for the War Department. But some of the prisoners whom I had befriended during my time as welfare officer now wanted to talk to me. They had some information they were going to give me, and next thing I know, I ended up in Nuremberg after all. And I fought it with tooth and nail because I was stupid. I was young, I had a wife and a baby son at home. I wanted to get enough brownie points to come home. I didn't want to go to Nuremberg, destroyed city, and be in that environment. But I didn't work. The army ruled. So I ended up being in Nuremberg. But we didn't do any more interrogation. But I could speak German fluently. And I had majored in psychology. So we had a prison psychiatrist, and the prison psychiatrist's job was to determine the IQ of the prisoners, their state of mind, their personality, quirks, whether they were sane or not, at the request of the War Crimes Commission. But the psychiatrist couldn't speak German. He was an American major from the University of California, professor of psychiatry. So they found out I had majored in psychology at Miami University, and I could at least pronounce the psychological terms. So I became the interpreter for the prison psychiatrist in Nuremberg, while still gathering information by visiting some of the prisoners' families and learning more about them that way. And of course, we got to know Rudolf Hess quite well, who had not been in Luxembourg, joined us from where he was in England. And we learned a lot about Rudolf Hess and Hermann Goering. Their IQs, their state of mind. Goering, incidentally, had the third highest IQ of the 22 major Nazis. The highest IQ was Hjalmar Schacht, the finance minister. Arthur Seyss-Inquart was the second highest. Goering was the third. Goering was a dope addict. He had been shot in the groin during the putsch in 1923, and in the course of his recovery became addicted to morphine. And while he was the Reichsmarshal of the Third Reich, he quite frequently was put into a tank to detoxify and to treat him for his addiction. He brought with him a suitcase full of paracodeine tablets, which he chewed like M&Ms, sort of a mild Valium. But he took 20 to 40 of them a day, and we weaned him of that particular habit. There was so much of interest about their personalities and characteristics. I could keep you here all afternoon to tell you what we learned in the administration of our Rorschach ink blot test. And that is what was primarily used. And Major Kelly, the psychiatrist, was an expert in the Rorschach test. So I learned by being the interpreter on how to get people to look at ink blots and tell me what they thought of it. I don't know what else to do with it after that, but Major Kelly did. And we were able to provide Justice Jackson and his staff with a lot of the information. Eventually, the prisoners were tried. 11 of them were sentenced to death by hanging. One of them cheated the hangman, Hermann Goering, who produced a capsule of potassium cyanide and committed suicide 1 hour before he was to be hanged. I have a 45-minute speech on the mystery of Hermann Goering's suicide, but Dr. Miller tells me to run it down here in time, so I can't share that with you, but I'll be glad to answer your questions later. 11 sentenced to death by hanging, 10 were hanged. Goering committed suicide. 3 were acquitted, not because they were innocent, but we couldn't prove them guilty, because Justice Jackson conducted a trial that was fair according to the principles of American justice. These people had an opportunity to defend themselves. They heard the charges that were being brought against them, and I'm very proud to have been a part of that particular effort. Did it succeed in preventing future wars, like Justice Jackson hoped, by creating the charge of crimes against the peace, breaking non-aggression pacts and treaties? No. There have been 69 wars, including genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, ever since the trial. So it did not live up to Justice Jackson's dream of preventing future wars by making it a crime to plan and execute attacks on weaker and neighboring nations. Nevertheless, while we interrogated these people, 7 of whom were sentenced to prison for various terms from 10 years up to life imprisonment for Rudolf Hess. 2 of them were left the prison because they died of cancer shortly thereafter, but the others served full terms. When then President Reagan came to Bitburg on his controversial visit, Winnie and I were there. We went to hear him speak. Remember, it was very controversial because he went to a cemetery where some 49 Waffen SS were buried, and he was criticized. Of course, he didn't know they were there, and he hadn't been told. Nevertheless, he did accept the invitation of Chancellor Kohl to go to that cemetery, and we were there when he made a speech. And I'd like to quote, in conclusion, what President Reagan said on that occasion, because it's very apropos with what's going on at Camp Xray in Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, and what went on in Luxembourg and subsequently in Nuremberg. Reagan said in Pittsburgh, after visiting a German cemetery, the one lesson of World War II, the one lesson of Nazism is that freedom must always be stronger than totalitarianism, and that good must always be stronger than evil. The crimes and wars of yesterday cannot be undone, nor can we call the millions who died back to life. But we can learn something from the past and use the lessons we have learned to make a better future. End of quote. And that is what our sessions of this type and what books and everything else that are now being revived, so that we learn the lessons of the past and prevent the things from happening, those things to happen again in the future. Thank you very much for giving me a chance to share this.
We've got 5 minutes, and we must be out by 1 o'clock, but we could handle a few questions, I think.
Could you tell us what the motive of Hess going to England was about?
Did you all hear the question? What was the motive of Rudolf Hess going to England? Well, there have been a lot of stories about that. There are people who say that he was crazy. He was not. He was perfectly sane according to our Rorschach analysis test. He did plead amnesia when he was first taken prisoner, and it was a self-induced amnesia. He had not at all, self-induced in the sense that he refused during his 4.5 years in prison in England to recall anything. He just said, I don't recall, I don't remember. And according to the psychiatrist, it is possible to eventually turn your mind into a self-induced amnesia. If you deny things long enough, you eventually end up not remembering them. Well, in the course of the trials at Nuremberg, in the middle of the trial, Hess finally admitted that it was a self-induced amnesia, and he regained his memory and did enter into the defense and confessed that it was self-induced. Now, why did he fly to England? Well, a lot of those stories, various kinds of stories, my own opinion based on our interrogations is that he was not crazy. He did not become a traitor to Germany. He actually was sent on that mission. If you read Mein Kampf, Hitler said very clearly that if Germany ever again had to fight a war on 2 fronts, it would lose that war. So he would, with all his might, try to prevent a war on 2 fronts. After the invasion of Belgium and Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and after the victories in Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary, Hitler was determined to invade the Soviet Union. He was ready to break a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union and go into Russia. But he still had to worry about the British on his back and the possibility of the Americans being involved. This was before Pearl Harbor. So he had to do something to get the British out of the war and prevent the Americans from getting in. There was a pro-German, not necessarily a pro-Nazi, but a pro-German element in Great Britain. The Cliveden set, the Duke of Hamilton, even the American ambassador, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., at that time was against the war. Charles Lindbergh counseled against the war with Germany. And there were people in Great Britain who, even in a royal family, the Duke of Windsor, who were related to the Hanovers in Germany, who were against a war with Germany. Now, if Rudolf Hess could get to this pro-German element, the Duke of Hamilton in particular, whom he had met at the Olympics in 1936, and explain to them secretly that Germany was ready to invade the Soviet Union, and get them to lie low so that they wouldn't be fighting a war on 2 fronts, Hitler would have an opportunity to create a bulwark between Western democracy and Eastern communism, which is something we worked 40 years on in developing West Germany into a bulwark between communism and the West. Well, my conviction is, and on the basis of that with conversation with people on both sides, is that Hitler sent Hess to England with that particular mission. There's no way he could have flown to England in a Messerschmitt. There's no way he could have gotten the plane without Hitler knowing about it. And getting all through radar and landing on the Duke of Hamilton's estate by parachute. He was taken prisoner by a farmer with a pitchfork and taken to the local constabulary, and the cat was out of the bag. And then the British held him incognito for 4.5 years until the trial started in Nuremberg. As I say, my conviction of studying this in more detail than I have time to give you now is that Hitler sent Hess, and of course when the mission failed and he was arrested by a farmer with a pitchfork and the secret was out, the only thing the German government could do is to say, well, he was crazy, he was a traitor, and we've wiped him off the records. That's a long answer to a short question.
What's unusual, and you're the only survivor of that group and probably the only one really alive who had an opportunity to understand fully the mindset of those folks who really were the brains behind the Third Reich. And it's because what you provided to Justice Jackson, which was the groundwork upon which Nuremberg could have occurred. And I think I'm going to take the privilege of the floor here for a second to say we've got a couple of folks who, in the audience, just for the sake of recognizing them, we have the grandchildren of Robert Jackson here who made a special effort to come today for Professor Barrett and Ambassador Dolibois, Julia Craig Hill and Tom Loftus. And at the same time, a guy who had an extraordinary position at Nuremberg as well, Father Moritz Fuchs, who was Sergeant Moritz Fuchs, sitting right here, who was in fact Justice Robert Jackson's bodyguard throughout the entire time in Nuremberg. So that's not a question, David, so hopefully I took advantage of it, but thank you so much, Ambassador, for making this special.
The Jackson Center is a historical and educational facility dedicated to preserving the legacy of this country lawyer who became Solicitor General, Attorney General, a Justice of the Supreme Court, and served as Chief Prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials of Nazi war criminals following World War II. To learn more about this program, Robert Jackson, the Jackson Center, and upcoming events, the Jackson Center is located at 305 East 4th Street, Jamestown, New York, and found on the web at www.roberthjackson.org or contacted by telephoning 716-483-6646.